Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Really wonderful to be here at the Talking Philanthropy event. And on behalf of myself and my colleagues in our team, thanks from the Center for Strategic Philanthropy for participating in this superb platform on philanthropy in Asia. Delighted to be joined here today also by our academic director, Dr. Kamal Munir, and also the co-author of our research report on COVID-19 and how this is shifting the power dynamics in philanthropy. Good to see you, Kamal.
Hi.
I also wanted to remind our audience that please do join the conversation via Twitter. We've had some great discussions since this morning through social media platforms. So do hashtag Talking Philanthropy as you give us your feedback and your comments. Big thank you also to our partners and our co-hosts. I think the discussions this morning throughout the day have been really, really rich and provided a lot of opportunities for future collaboration. As you will have heard earlier from our Vice Chancellor at university, Professor Stephen Toop, there is an acknowledged lack of academic research on our sector, on the philanthropic sector, and a broader lack of knowledge and competences around exactly how much philanthropic capital is coming to market and how can we deploy it for maximum impact. As Badr Jaffer, our founder, just said, the opportunity of Asia is huge because of the economic growth and because of this projected $2 trillion intergenerational wealth transfer, $2 trillion. So really, we know that philanthropy can do more and is likely to have much more impact in the future. And both of those 2 points, the lack of research and knowledge, and yet this huge growth opportunity is really the raison d'etre for the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. We're really here to try and help maximize impact for this new philanthropic capital coming from these growth markets. And I was particularly happy to hear that the Ban Ki-moon mentioning this morning SDG 17, the SDG that talks about greater collaboration. I think in a way, almost listening to him talk about multi-stakeholder partnerships made me think that it's almost as if SDG 17 was invented for philanthropy and the role that it can play in bringing multi-sector actors to the table to solve some of the world's most entrenched socioeconomic challenges. I think for us, today's event, two of the most critical aspects are around that opportunity of how do we bring more actors in to work with philanthropists. We know we can't deliver social value at scale alone. We know in particular that we need governments to facilitate this growth of philanthropic capital. So that's a really important area for us. And the second, as a research center, is of course the absence of research. We really need more data, more understanding of where is this philanthropic capital coming from? How can it create more social impact? And how can we do that together? And I was also delighted to see this morning that our fellow researchers came up with some very similar findings to our own around the broader trends. They were particularly focused on China, whereas we're looking specifically at Southeast Asia. But really the trends are aligned. So both the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society talking about this huge potential of philanthropic capital as a counterpart even to aid. They mentioned that if Asians are giving 2% of GDP on a par with US donors, then that really equates to some 12 times net foreign aid. So we know that the growth in philanthropy can have huge impact, but we also know, as was mentioned in their Doing Good Index, there is still a lack of trust of our sector. And that's something that we really need to address and something that we feel more data and more research will help. And we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. And the second point about looking at Chinese growth, where you're seeing an average of 28% per annum over 16 years of philanthropic capital growing, coming to market. I mean, just phenomenal numbers. So how do we make sure that we use that capital wisely and effectively? So last year, as the pandemic hit, we went to market to try and understand more broadly about the sectors of what's happening in philanthropy, but specifically around COVID-19. We interviewed multiple industry experts and participated in multiple webinars and forums, really trying to understand, had COVID shifted the power dynamics? Had COVID actually changed some of the practices of philanthropy that historically we had called out and that historically we wanted to address? So before I share with you the specific findings of our research, I want to turn to Kamal. Kamal, talk to us a little bit more about those early discussions we had around why we chose that topic, why power matters, and particularly why it matters for philanthropy.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. That's right. I mean, so as you suggest, anecdotally and intuitively, we could see that there was pressure from the front lines to unrestrict funding. There was also a recognition that things were happening so quickly and alarming situations developing so rapidly that it was absolutely paramount to take on board the knowledge that was being created in real time on the front lines. Now, this we thought might be colliding with the parameters that had been set for decades in global philanthropy. So, for example, we knew that there were clear patterns in global philanthropy, especially when it came to North and South relationship in philanthropy, who gave and who received, what criteria were employed in selecting beneficiaries, what causes tended to receive more funds than others, how the monitoring and evaluation process tended to take place, and so on. So was any of this changing given the unprecedented situation? Now, changing of this would have enormous implications for the North-South relationship. I mean, in a way, it almost felt like a breaching experiment. I mean, ethnomethodologists at the University of Chicago in the 1950s, 60s, Goffman, Garfinkel, used to disrupt everyday life by introducing unprecedented situations. And usually, you and I just read from scripts. I mean, that's what we call background expectancy. We know what we are expected to do in any situation. It is when we need to think anew from scratch that new possibilities come to the fore. So in this case, power relations between the global North and South framed the grants that were being given by the North to the South. So that really made us think about how power is manifest in this particular relationship. And power can manifest itself in various ways. In philanthropy, on the face of it, more powerful organizations may be helping less powerful ones, but by doing it in a particular way, for instance, by keeping them out of key decisions about who to fund, what to fund, and how, they might simultaneously be foreclosing developmental possibilities for them. So, French philosopher Michel Foucault talked about power knowledge. This is often taken to mean that knowledge is power. That is not what he meant. What he really meant was that all knowledge embodies power relations. So when we learn and utilize particular knowledge, we are perpetuating someone's power over us. In other words, power is exercised not only when an actor's decision is influenced by another, but also when certain courses of action are prevented from entering the decision-making arena. In order to reverse this process, we need to create our own knowledge, our own processes. And it is in this process that one discovers new possibilities that are previously hidden. And so COVID forced us into that situation. We went into the field to see if this was indeed happening, and if it was, in what ways was it manifesting itself? What were the possibilities that were coming up? And so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what the findings were, Claire. Back to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kamal. And indeed, it was exactly that. So exploring that best practice that so often had been dictated from the better resourced global foundation and hadn't necessarily taken into account local dynamics in local markets. And I think what we found in looking at growth markets, and in particular Southeast Asia, was three particular ways in which COVID actually did serve as a catalyst to shift some of those power dynamics and drive a much more localized focus and a much more localized way of bringing new ideas and new methodologies to the table. So there were three particular areas that we identified of where COVID, we believe, has shifted some of those power constructs that you've just talked about. The first area, we're seeing a lot more flexibility on the part of global grant makers in how they deploy philanthropic capital, what the conditionality is around that, and just how they engage with their grantees. We heard from the Loudest Foundation, which works extensively in Asia, around how they had done their utmost to simplify the process of making grants much more accessible than perhaps they historically had been. Shell Foundation, that works also in Asia in the energy sector, spoke to us about how they have really helped them understand the importance of adding a diversity or a gender lens to how they issue grants, how they do their social investment. We saw multiple participants in our research spoke about the Ford Foundation as being a real leader in terms of giving that flexibility around how grants are dispersed and how they could be readjusted, repurposed because of the crisis. And we're going to hear later on today from the UN Foundation about how they managed to mobilize philanthropic capital much more quickly than they had historically, literally within a matter of weeks. So that was the first, a real wake-up call on the part of global grant makers around how they needed to be much more flexible and much more pragmatic. The second area was around digitization, which of course has impacted all organizations and not just our sector. But I think the digitization, the acceleration of digitization in these emerging markets really demonstrated to the third sector and how to philanthropists, how essentially they'd been missing a trick. For many of our organizations, it showed how they could connect much more quickly with their peers. So multiple groups in Asia told us around how they were using WhatsApp groups to share data in real time about needs, PPE, etc. Organizations saying how historically connecting across some of these huge regions was difficult if you don't have travel budgets, etc. But now they were using Zoom, not only to connect with remote regions, but also using language translation capacity. So being able to overcome some of the former language barriers. And of course, Zoom is not a new technology. It's been around for a while, but COVID was the catalyst for that change. Our friends at Tonoto Foundation in Indonesia did some amazing work where they very quickly repurposed their education program. So they were able to provide support through conferencing, through video calls, through social media to educators. So we really saw a new level of innovation on the part of the third sector around how technology can help not just bring connectivity, but share data, share ideas. And that leads nicely to our final core finding from the research, which was around peer solidarity and community. So we saw a huge amount of peer mentoring, peer learning, peer funding that we hadn't seen prior to COVID. We heard this from most of the people that we spoke to, that this historical perhaps tendency to look to global foundations for support was now fading into the background, where they were looking for resilience from their immediate community. Naina Batra, the CEO of the AVPN, the Asia Philanthropy Network, told us that this historical dependence was really starting to shift, and where global portfolios are being seen to dry up, people are looking for local funding and local collaboration. Indonesia for Humanity and the Yayasan Hasanah Foundation Malaysia both talked about how they had found opportunities to work with the local private sector. So getting access to CSR funds where historically they might not have been able to do so. So I think that real element of peer learning, solidarity, communities coming together to support each other, given the gravity of the crisis, was something particularly important and a very welcome shift from historical patterns. But as we also found, still, in these growth markets, we still face challenges around institutional voids that perhaps global grant makers are not always aware of and perhaps don't always exist in other markets. So Kamal, if you can just share with us a little bit more here about what are those institutional voids and why are these so prevalent in emerging markets?
That's right, Claire. So, this was very interesting. What was happening out there was quite interesting for us, because what we could see was that this particular crisis was kind of putting the existing hierarchy in decision-making to the background, and in the foreground emerged, a new way of making decisions, which was much more collaborative. And because there was an actual need that, like I mentioned before, that the knowledge, that we needed to possess in order to make decisions was coming up in real time on the front lines. So the people working on the front lines who would normally perhaps not have as much of a say in making those decisions were, had to be included in the decision making. But so this, we felt that our interviewees felt this was very empowering and this was very liberating, right? And they wanted to build upon that. Right? Now, in order to build upon that, we also need to think about the infrastructure and what is already present. And in that, we discovered that if we are to build upon that, we need to fill certain institutional voids. So our exploration of new trends in the global South philanthropy field revealed the existence of a number of institutional voids or institutional arrangements that were absent. So our research suggested that the most important amongst them revolved around, first of all, access to information, and knowledge and non-conducive regulatory environments and leading to ad hoc policy making and an absence of actionable data. So as far as access to information and knowledge is concerned, organizational capacity was found to be quite limited in this sense. Boards and technical advice from grant makers has been chronically underused. For decades, philanthropic organizations have extolled the value of non-financial inputs, including technical advice on scenario planning, strategy, funding, back office systems. Yet we found this deficit continues to exist. And many of the organizations we interviewed noted that the pandemic was beginning to change this. So grant makers and boards went beyond standard governance practices, such as providing high-level strategy input. They listened more. They strived to truly understand grantees' detailed needs and responded with ongoing coaching, mentoring, strategy advice, and so on. Similarly, in regulatory environments, global South governments often see the philanthropic sector as a threat almost, rather than an ally. And yet, with more efficient and more conducive regulations, global South philanthropic organizations could likely mature faster, deliver more impact, and secure more funding. So governments in emerging markets, have typically struggled to find a healthy balance between enforcing anti-money laundering, counterterrorism regulations, and creating incentives, fiscal or otherwise, to encourage giving. So we found that uniform, fit-for-purpose regulation for the sector across Global South was still weak, or in some cases entirely missing, thus preventing philanthropy from reaching its true potential. And finally, we found there was an absence of actionable data. So databases and up-to-date, perhaps digitally stored information seemed to be lacking. And the philanthropic sector really needed to undergo transformation to improve data capture and dissemination and drive much greater transparency. And we also found that there was a constant need to seek validation from the global north. And so sources of actionable data did need to come up within the global south. So now what can be done about this? Back to you, Claire.
Thanks, Kamal. Absolutely. So picking up on the points that you've made, we came up with 3 recommendations, really some of the 3 core things that emerged from the points you made around institutional voids and our earlier signs of how power balance is shifting, that recommendations we felt can build on that. So help create this shift of power and transform it into long-term system change in order to maximize impact. So those 3 areas were, number 1, networks. Can't emphasize enough the importance of networks. So we are already working in Asia with the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network and the Asia Philanthropy Circle, amongst other global networks. And never before did we see really the value of these networks come to the fore in terms of providing resources, connecting communities, giving an opportunity for collective bargaining, sharing research, the point you made earlier about the lack of data, sharing data, offering up a peer mentoring, competence development, helping the more under-resourced, more fragile organizations to really resource up and build resilience during the pandemic. And yet we know that networks are so often overlooked when it comes to global funding. It's difficult to track the impact or demonstrate the impact of a network. And yet these networks exactly address the issues you talked about, Kamal, around infrastructure. So we believe that there needs to be a much stronger focus on networks, much more funding to networks. These are a very powerful way of driving resilience in the sector. The second point that you also mentioned there is the governments and philanthropic partnerships. We heard about it earlier today from some of our colleagues on this conference around the huge, powerful potential of philanthropic government partnerships. So let's overcome the aversion of the past of governments working with philanthropists and help them to understand that philanthropic capital is partnership capital. It can bring risk and innovation, new ways of thinking, and governments can then scale up philanthropic interventions. So these opportunities of working with governments that perhaps historically had been overlooked, we saw them come to the fore because of COVID. We saw, for example, we heard earlier today from Kathleen Chu of YTL in Malaysia, how they had built a digital education program that through partnering with the government then essentially went nationwide. And we've seen multiple examples of that elsewhere, of how governments through COVID understood the value of partnerships with philanthropists, and we encourage that. And finally, again, a point that will come as no surprise to most of our audience, the importance of core funding, which has also been mentioned by earlier speakers. We found systematically people talking to us about this NPO starvation cycle, the not-for-profit sector starvation cycle, where donors are not willing to give money beyond a specific program. Really, we believe that needs to stop. Yes, we need to build trust in the sector so that donors can give unconditionally, unrestricted funding. But there also needs to be a recognition that without core funding for internal infrastructure, these organizations cannot hire top talent. They cannot build out effective management systems. They cannot build innovation for program development, and thus they can't deliver maximum impact. So we can't emphasize enough the importance of core funding. And indeed, our friends at Loudest Foundation recently put out an entire report on this and stated quite categorically, if the donor is set up to make real change, this is the way to do it, with unrestricted funding, because that's how you're going to get higher impact. And we have heard this before. We heard it during COVID from the US Council on Foundations and their pledge. And indeed, earlier today with Ben's interview with Chris Putnam-Walkley and her book on delusional altruism, the same message coming across. So we know there is consensus around the absolute importance of core funding. So I'm afraid we have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but I'll be coming back to you later on in the closeout session with some more ideas around how we continue to drive this collaboration. Thanks to you, Kamal, for joining us today. We'll let you go back to teaching now. Thanks to everybody else for joining us on today's session from the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. More from me later, but now let's go to our friends at the Community Jameel Foundation and hear from them. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.